Okay, so the first of the dominoes to fall is an incident that happens in the Nacogdoches area, which of course is the East Texas area. And it's got kind of a dumb name that makes you hate history. It's called the Fredonian Rebellion, and it happened in 1826-27. Uh, it's the way you want to think about the Fredonian Rebellion in your mind is it's the first domino that's going to fall that's going to lead to the Texas Revolution. The dominoes might have fallen another way in an alternate universe, but I think the result would have probably been the same. As I said in class, I think at some point the U.S. was just too strong and Texas was too weak. It's hard for me to think that Texas wouldn't have become part of the United States. But we're going to talk about the process that allowed Texas to become part of the United States. And so you just think of it as dominoes falling, okay? So the Fredonian Rebellion. Again, I know it's a boring name. There was a guy named Hayden Edwards, and he was a nut, okay? He was actually more than a nut. He was a bit of a villain. He was a former U.S. Senator from Kentucky. He owned a number of slaves. He owned a mansion in Mississippi. And somehow he secured an impresario grant. And remember, the impresarios, those are the folks that are legally allowed to bring Americans into Mexico. The Mexican government, gives you permission to bring a group of families into Mexico. And he's given permission to bring Americans into Nacogdoches. But immediately there is conflict. And the reason for this conflict is that Nacogdoches, as you might remember, you probably should remember it because there'll be a question on it on the midterm. Nacogdoches is fairly old by Texas standards. Remember, it was created um, in the 1760s when folks were kicked out of East Texas, and then they petitioned Mexico City and they were allowed to move back into the Nacogdoches area. So, bottom line, Tejanos had been in Nacogdoches for a long time, and probably their biggest business was smuggling horses into Louisiana. So Edward shows up kind of out of nowhere, and he tries to oust these settlers, these Tejanos, that in some instances had been in the Nacogdoches area for generations. And he demands that the settlers pay him for their land, which of course infuriates them. And some of the people that he angers in the Nacogdoches areas are Tejanos. They're Mexican officials, and they're not going to pay this idiot Hayden Edwards for the land that they've owned for generations. And Edwards had just really he extended his reach. He just went way too far in demanding folks pay him for land that they'd owned for generations. And so these officials, they complain to Mexico City. They go, "What are you doing? This guy Hayden Edwards has just shown up. He's trying to make us pay for land that our families have owned for generations. You've got to put a stop to this," which the Mexican government does. It revokes his impresario charter and kicks him out of Texas. Well, Edwards does something. He does something desperate from his point of view, or maybe he sees it as bold. He comes back into Texas with about a couple of dozen men, and he proclaims a new republic in Texas, the Republic of Fredonia. I don't know where he got the name Fredonia. Maybe it's because it's free. It sounds like kind of a comedy or something. But he's deadly serious. He wants to break Texas, or this part of Texas, from Mexico. Well, as you should know by now, Mexico City, whether it's run by the Spanish or by the Mexican government, is very sensitive to what goes on at the border with Louisiana. Very, very sensitive. This is one of the themes of this part of the course, right? So Edwards, although he only has 30 men, it's not a serious revolt, and this Republic of Fredonia, doesn't really have a chance of succeeding. What's ingrained in the DNA of officials in Mexico City, even now that they're Mexican, not Spanish, anytime there's trouble along the Texas-Louisiana border, they're going to sit up and take notice. Okay, this is just the way it was. Just had been going on for hundreds of years, ever since La Salle. So they decide that they have to come in and crush Edwards. They're not the only ones. Stephen F. Austin is just enraged by what Edwards does. He just sees Edwards as coming up and just screwing up the whole situation. He writes Edwards and he says, the people in your quarter have run mad or worse. They are destroying themselves. They're building up the credit of their enemies with the Mexican government and jeopardizing the prospect of hundreds of innocent families who wish to live in peace and quietness in this country. So what Austin is saying to Edwards is, what are you doing, you idiot? You're screwing up the situation for all the rest of us by your stupid Republic of Fredonia. And so Edwards had expected the Anglos who had come into Texas. He thought that they would flock to him and that they would fight against Mexico, but it doesn't happen at all. What happens is Stephen F. Austin actually sends up some troops along with Mexican soldiers to help expel Edwards from Texas, because Austin wants to show the government in Mexico City, okay, this Edwards, this guy's an outlier. You can trust me, you can't trust him. And so Edwards disappears from history. He's chased back into the United States, and we don't really hear from him again. But what the thud that you're hearing is the sound of a domino, okay? Because now just what Austin feared was about to happen. Mexico City was so chaotic after it gained independence, it really couldn't pay much attention to Texas. But now it's paying attention to Texas because of Hayden Edwards and the Fredonian Revolution. And Mexico City decides it needs to send up a Mexican official and see what the hell is going on in Texas. What's going on in its northeast? Now remember, Texas is still part of Mexico, right? So what Mexico City's doing, they're trying to figure out what's going on in their northeast, where Mexico borders Louisiana, because remember, Texas is part of Mexico. So after the debacle, here's the second domino that's going to fall, and this will show up on my outline. Mexico City, the government in Mexico City sends General Manuel Mayer y Terán to study the eastern border of Texas. And on the face of it, he was supposed to study the need for military forts in eastern Texas. He was supposed to do some studies of the natural world in Texas as well. But secretly, he was going to report back to the Mexican government about Anglo influence in Texas. What was going on in Texas? The Mexico City had just kind of lost track of Texas, and now they're trying to figure out what the heck is going on. So Tehran comes up into Texas, and it's not an exaggeration to say he is totally freaked out by what he finds. As he moves, he probably came in through the San Juan Bautista, through San Antonio, La Bahia, but he goes into the Nacogdoches area. He goes into the Anglo area of Texas, where Anglos have now settled. This is 1829. So Anglos have been in Texas for about a decade, a little bit less. And as he goes into the Anglo area of Mexican Texas, he realizes that Mexico's very weak in this area. In Nacogdoches, the Mexican population was poor and small compared to the Anglo-American population. Tehran reported that Nacogdoches was already an American town. It was more U.S. than it was Mexico. That eastern Texas as a whole was much more U.S. than it was Mexico. It technically was under Mexican sovereignty, but the settlers hadn't learned Spanish for the most part. They weren't Roman Catholic. They looked to New Orleans for credit and financing and all that kind of a thing, raw materials or products. And he says in a famous quote that will probably show up in a midterm or a quiz that Mexico needed to act now or Texas would be lost forever. This is a very, very famous quote. And think about the alarm that's behind that quote. That Mexico City needs to act now or Mexico will be lost forever. And so he proposes that Mexico colonize more Mexicans in Texas, that they attempt to bring more European Anglos into Texas instead of American Anglos, U.S. Anglos, because Europeans would come in without slavery. And he also suggests that Mexico bring more troops into Texas, that Texas is not being well policed by the Mexican government, so it has to be policed. And one of the things that Tehran wants to do, he wants to start collecting taxes on all the cotton that's coming out of Texas. By 1829, almost 500,000 pounds of cotton, and that's a lot of money. And so he also suggests, in bringing up troops from Mexico into Texas, one of the things he's trying to do in gaining control over Texas, he also wants to create a revenue stream for the Mexican government by taxing the cotton that's leaving Texas and going to New Orleans. Almost no Texas cotton went into Mexico. It all went into the United States. So this was his game plan. This was his game plan, and I'll talk about the consequences of that in the next podcast.